Have you ever had those dreams where you're like running away, but you can't run properly and your legs are moving in slow motion? Or I had this one where I have to fight somebody, but I can't land the punch and the arm is just like moving in slow motion, very ineffectual. It's incredibly stressful. And you wake up and you're sweating. Okay, everybody's had these dreams of some kind or another. Other people tell me they regularly have this dream where they're they're late for an exam and they're like trying to get across campus. Or the other one that's fairly common is you're in a classroom or you're at church, but you're naked and you're trying to cover up and you realize and it's super embarrassing. Hopefully this is not just a glimpse into my own psyche, but many of you will be having some kind of solidarity with my nightmares. And truth be told, there's quite a bit of science that's been happening on dreaming. Obviously, Freud set us up for a science of dreaming 100 years ago or more. But some much more interesting, I think, neurological findings and cognitive science findings are coming out on dreaming, such that we're getting a better sense of it. One thing we do know, which is not surprising to me, is that usually 80% of all human dreams are negative, and only 20% of them are positive. So if you have a lot of nightmares or you have a lot of anxiety dreams, welcome to the club. So there's an interesting debate about whether dreams are meaningful or whether they're some kind of cognitive noise or just kind of litter. And there's a poet named Thomas Nash who wrote, quote, "A dream is nothing else but a bubbling scum or froth of the fancy, which the day hath left undigested." Fancy here refers to the imagination. So according to Thomas Nash, and I think even there's a contemporary version of this, the dream is really just noise. You get all kinds of memories and feelings throughout the waking day, and then that gets stuck in the system, and then the system is just sort of flushing and sort of cycling through during REM sleep. So that's a kind of denial about the meaning of dreams. There's a kind of funny moment in Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol where Ebenezer Scrooge is having a dream about a ghost. I guess it's the ghost of his former employee or partner, Marlowe. Instead of sort of accepting this as some kind of meaningful thing, he attempts to deny it as meaningful and kind of gives it this same sense that Thomas Nash gave it, as a kind of bubbling froth. It's interesting that there's a lot of digestion metaphors. Maybe that was just some kind of 19th century thing. Anyway, Dickens has Scrooge say, quote, "You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." End quote. That's a great line. There's more of gravy in you. Okay, so here's somebody who really doesn't want his dream to mean something because it's a kind of warning. And so that raises this question I want to talk about today, which is, are dreams noise, or are they sort of wish fulfillment fantasies, or are they warnings of some kind or preparations for dangers in real life? And so that's the topic today on Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. Welcome. Okay, Freud really got us going. He gave us a good start. He made all kinds of mistakes, and many of us are aware of his mistakes. But he did do a good job of getting us to think about dreams as being meaningful. He argued that dreams are a place where the unconscious, which is by and large kept asleep and docile during waking hours, is allowed to wake up and run rampant. And what happens usually is you get a dream that is a kind of wish fulfillment fantasy. You really want to sleep with this person at work, or you really want to murder this person at school. But of course, your conscious mind has repressed all that and made you into a civilized human being. Nonetheless, when you shut off the civilized person, which we now understand is sort of the frontal areas of the brain, like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, those do go quiet. Those executive self-censoring aspects of the brain go quiet and dormant when you go to sleep. And then all that limbic stuff wakes up and runs around. There's some evidence that when you're dreaming, your body really just thinks it is being chased by a monster, or you're having sex with the person that you desire. And then you're having the same sort of physiological responses to that, which is why you wake up sweating or with various other bodily changes. But you have sleep atonia, where the brain, also has this switch which turns your body off so that you're not actually running in place under the covers. The parts of the body and brain that handle defense and sort of crisis mode are on and working while you're dreaming about a crisis mode. But Freud's analysis, as we all know, famously was mostly about sex. And he had a theory that you have a kind of two levels of meaning in the dream, and really out in the art world too. Like you have a manifest meaning and a latent meaning. The manifest meaning will be the way it looks to you on the sort of on the face of things. Like you're dreaming of a cigar, smoking a cigar. But of course, for Freud, the latent meaning is that the cigar is a kind of symbol of a phallus or a penis. Why is it coded? Because Freud thought you really can't handle the truth. Even in the dream world, you have to lie to yourself because the stuff you really want is so ugly that you can't face it. You can't face it in real life, and you can't even face it in the dream world, but at least the dream world will try to work it through and give you a kind of catharsis, if only in this weird kind of coded narrative about smoking cigars and whatever else. For example, dreaming of a chest of drawers is sort of a metaphor, Freud thought, for the female anatomy. Empty chambers or filled chambers within a larger vessel, and these represent the uterus and the womb. And okay, Freud, fine, interesting. But the general point I think that Freud came up with is by and large still available and still reasonable, which is you're working through something important for your emotional life, and you can't do it in waking life. The idea is that there are sort of emotional wishes and desires that need to be processed and gotten out of the system in order for you to be a healthier person. Okay, so that's Freud. The idea that dreams are meaningful and have a kind of story, I think, is really obvious to many of us, because oftentimes you feel better after a dream or you feel worse, and there's a clear sort of storyline that you can identify. All of us recognize that there's an interesting kind of storyline that's happening. It might be weird and bizarre, but there's an interesting storyline happening in dreams. One time I was waking up my son to go to school, and he was young. It was like 5, so maybe he was in first grade. As I sort of shook him and said, okay, it's time to wake up, he was like, oh, hold on, Dad. The credits are still running. Let me just watch the credits. And I thought that was really funny because I'm not sure if in his dream, he was watching a movie or his dreams have credits, which is really amazing. That would be great. I think that his dreams might have credits, but he doesn't remember them very well. I just happened to catch him like in the middle of it. Now, this raises a very interesting question about kids and dreaming. Kids have very high levels of REM sleep. You'll recall that when they first started doing EEG on brains, they discovered this sort of a wave pattern of the rapid eye movement phase of dreaming, and people correlated dreaming with REM. That's not strictly true because you will dream in non-REM sleep, but most of your dreaming does happen during rapid eye movement. And what they found is that little kids, like 4, they have very high levels of REM, but very low levels of dreaming. People couldn't figure out why that was, and we're still not entirely sure why that is, because you'd think they must be dreaming more than adults do. One theory that's put forward by a dream researcher named Michaela Schragfru is that you need stories, and you need a sort of familiarity with stories in order to really be able to dream. Now, this is a radical theory, but consider it for a moment. When you're really young, like 2 years old, kids start to hear stories at a very early age. They can't understand what's going on. You hold the book, you read it, you turn the page. They start to get a sense of sequential narrative. And of course, we're showing little kids, as soon as we have like TV and we have films and stuff, we're showing them all kinds of narrative structures from a very early age. I remember showing my kid all this like baby Bach stuff and baby Mozart, so it'd be like real simple like toys moving around and then like Mozart in the background, and they would just stare at it. You begin to learn how to predict what's going to happen next if you're a little developing mind. And so the theory is that it's not until you start to hear stories and think about stories and begin to even like tell stories and read that your mind gets the architecture for dreaming. So before you have this architecture, you have like sense impressions and memories, just images, images of grandpa and images of like a birthday cake and balloons and a dog. But you don't have like a scaffolding to slot these things into in order to sort of put them into some kind of coherent pattern. And that's what stories give to human beings. And I find this to be a really compelling theory. For one thing, that would explain why kids could be having REM but not a whole lot of dreaming until they get a little bit older, and then all of a sudden it kicks in because they understand story better. It also gives some credence to Darwin's claim in The Descent of Man, where he said, in a way, dreaming is a kind of involuntary art of poetry, that dreaming is a kind of version of the imagination, but it's an involuntary imagination. So maybe our first kind of imaginative creativity is this involuntary phase. There is a lot of correlation between what the brain is doing in dreaming and what the brain is doing in waking imagination. In particular, what's called the default mode network is very active, and this is a part of the brain where the kind of executive parts of the brain that are usually in control are quieted down, and some of the more associational parts of the brain are more active. And that seems to be common in dreams and in regular imagination during waking life. Now, to give greater credence to this idea about the relationship between dreaming and storytelling, you can actually look at dreams as having almost like genres. So, for example, if we think about a taxonomy of dreams that would have like 4 basic kinds in it, you'd say, well, one of them would be anxiety, one would be transcendent dreams, one would be existential dreams, and the last would be alienation dreams. Everybody's had anxiety dreams. As I said, 80% of all dreaming is negative. But if you look at anxiety dreams, might correlate really well with the horror genre. So stories about monsters and horror, whether they be told around the campfire or in movies or in books and plays, that correlates well with a certain kind of dream. Existential dreams about the meaning of life and grief and death sort of find a correlation in the genre of tragedy. Transcendent dreams, I think, they're rare, but they happen. You ever have that dream where you're flying or you're super powerful and you wake up kind of exhilarated? It really would be great if that happened more often, but it doesn't. But it correlates very well with the genre of superheroes or heroes in general, or the kind of fantasy of legend in folklore. I mean, long before we had sort of Marvel Avenger genres that everybody's so apeshit about, we had stories like Beowulf and stories like from the Iliad and the Odyssey. And finally, alienation dreams are these ones that correlate well with the genre of like mystery, or I would say sort of like Franz Kafka and the sort of literature of surreal alienation where you just feel strange and uncanny. We have a whole literature of that developed from Kafka on to the present through David Lynch. And of course, it's no accident that Lynch also has a wonderful connection to the dream world in his imaginative work as well. But now all this brings me to the main theory I want to talk about, which is very exciting. And this is the theory of threat simulation rehearsal. This idea is relatively recent, and it suggests that when you're dreaming, your brain is essentially rehearsing real threats in virtual space so that you can then function better in real life. And this means like consolidating emotions, dreaming about how you would handle a predator or a threat, like what you would do in a fight, how you would run away, how you would attack. And the argument here is something like, in the dream state, you can engage in threat rehearsal so that when in waking life you meet a real threat, you will adapt to it more quickly, with better quality, and you will survive better. And if you survive better, you live to procreate. And if you procreate, you spread that gene to the larger population. So what's happening here is a kind of evolution of dreaming as threat rehearsal. It makes a lot of sense because if you can survive better in the waking world because you're just quicker on your feet when facing threats, then that ability is going to be selected for. Natural selection can see that, metaphorically speaking. And if it's genetically based, it'll reproduce it. And so that's a very interesting argument for the evolution of dreaming, that it helps the individual, but it also helps the species. So what are the things that are haunting you in your dreams? What are the threats that are coming at you? Well, disease, accidents. I sometimes have dreams about like falling from a great height, sort of bodily damage, violence. And violence, I think, could be wrapped under a larger category of just social threats. Human beings are extremely social animals. What are the ways in which other human beings threaten us? Well, as I said, violence and war, but also damage to your reputation, gossip, betrayals, and all kinds of other sort of small abuses that occur within the social world that can really damage us. And so we're very vigilant about them. Do you dream a lot about social encounters that are negative? I think a lot of us do. And that indicates that one of our main sources of threat is the social world, is the other human being. Now, if this is true, it leads to a very interesting hypothesis, which is children from very violent or abusive or high threat situations in real life should be dreaming more about threats and violence and should be having more nightmares. That sort of falls out from the theory. And so it's very interesting that a group did a study of this exact question by essentially looking at and studying the dreams of two populations of children. One is a group of Kurdish children from northern Iraq, and they did, I think, like over 140 kids. They studied their dreams. They would basically interview them and get information about the quantity and the quality of the dreams. And the other group they were studying were a group of something like 80 kids from Finland. And this was in the early 2000s, maybe up into the mid 2000s. And they found that the Kurds at that time, and really for a long time, have had a fairly violent history there of oppression and struggle. And so kids have seen a lot of violence in northern Iraq. At the time of the study, Finland, which also has a very complicated history, nonetheless had relative stability. Kids were having fairly secure and stable childhoods when the test was done. And what they found was what you might expect, which is that the Kurdish kids were having many more negative dreams. The quality of the threats were much more intense. And the kids from the Finnish population were showing, just as you would expect, less negative dreams, although some, and they were less often, so quantity, and less intense, so the quality was not as bad. And the nature of those dreams were not as violent. So this makes a certain amount of sense. Now, it doesn't settle the matter because one could still argue that, okay, the violence in waking life is causing the violence in dream life, and that's the end of the story. The threat rehearsal argument is, however, that the more the kid dreams about violence and responds to it in the dream, the more they will be effective in real life, in a sort of threat structure. So I suppose the next scientific level of the experiment should be, and this is kind of a creepy experiment, but to see, do kids who dream a lot of negative things, do they survive better under real threat situations in waking life? Now, that's a very hard scientific experiment to do, so many things to control and quantify. I find it very exciting because it makes sense out of dreams. It's so much more interesting, I think, than just the Freudian view, although I think there's some truth in that too. And it shows us that the dreams are not, as Thomas Nash said, a bubbling froth or residue of the day's activity. One last thing to say about dreams is, as negative as they are, for the most part, I have talked to a wonderful dream researcher named Dr. Deirdre Barrett, and she also does amazing artwork. But she was telling me that you can influence your dreams and tilt them towards the positive if you do sort of these little meditations before you go to sleep, where you kind of quiet the mind and you kind of focus, okay, here's what I want to dream about, and here's how I want to dream about it. And a lot of times it isn't going to work, but sometimes it does, and with higher statistical frequency than you might imagine. So I was asking her about, after my father passed away, I really wanted to talk to him in a dream, just to sort of reconnect with him. And she said that it is possible to sort of think before you go to sleep about somebody who you love and who you want to see again in the dream, and that you can oftentimes increase the likelihood of encountering them in the dream in a positive way. So that's where I want to leave it today and encourage you to do this, because it is something that's kind of an act of will and voluntary, like before you're going to bed, but it can produce something beautiful in the involuntary world of the dreams. And when 80% of our dreams are negative, it would be nice to have a little bit of an increase on that 20% of positivity. So thanks as usual for coming to Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. And remember, always stay curious. I will see you next time.